And excellent. And then I'll share screen. Right. Okay. So fingers crossed for those of you who have just joined us. We haven't got Zoe with us today to record. So fingers crossed the recording is successful. And we are now at the start of the teaching part of the 5th session of the book club for the First Aid for Feelings manual. So then, as before the previous recordings, there's that kind of, we've already had a check-in about the experience from last week, some of the feelings, some of the observations. We've got the usual kind of guidelines for the day. And then the focus for today is chapter 9, 10, and 11, which is why self-compassion is so vital, coming to your senses and bringing it all together. You got this. And I remember when Nikki and I decided on the title for that chapter, we really felt both that they needed to have the "you got this" in the title for this chapter. So then if we look at why self-compassion is so important, we talk about it in the manual, quite a few reasons. The main one, so I won't necessarily go into them in detail here now, but the main one is that actually, and I've mentioned this before, that your self-relationship, the person that's with you every single moment, every single breath of your day is you. There's nobody else, not your kids, not your siblings, not your parents, not your lovers or partners. Nobody's with you all the time. And so being able to actually recognize that there is the primary relationship is the one with yourself is key to being able to have a lovely, caring, creative, joyful existence, but also then to have meaningful connections, not just with ourselves, but also with other people. And so given that just how important that relationship is, that having self-compassion where we can recognize our limitations, our flaws, our weaknesses, where we trip up, where we are unskillful, means that there's a love at the heart of how we relate to ourselves. Hence, we've got like a 24/7 here in the corner, because that is that 24/7 relationship. It's there every breath. Even when we're sleeping, we're in a self-relationship. So I'm going to leave that part there. We can talk about that more in the Q&A at the end, but I really want to invite you to look at that in the manual. We refer to research by like Kristin Neff and others. So many of us are talking about this power of self-compassion and how really it is at the key and the heart of everything we do. If I'm able to be compassionate with myself, I am much more likely to be able to be genuinely compassionate with other people. We often think about it the other way around, that we're able to be compassionate to other people. But actually, when we look kind of underneath that, that self-compassion may be short-lived if they do something that bugs us, or if they do something that contradicts our values or beliefs. You know, if they vote for a different party. It's election here in the UK, it's an election in the US. I can't remember with Argentina. I know there's an election in France, so there's a lot of voting and opinions going on here. So that kind of actually being compassionate to others is often conditional until we're able to have true self-compassion or more self-compassion with ourselves, where we can then be more compassionate to others, but we will then be mindful that there may be strong boundaries whilst we are compassionate with other people. So coming back to ourselves, really looking at how compassionate am I with myself, because that is a really important part of the whole thing. So there are 4 things that tend to interact or interfere or limit our ability to be self-compassionate. First one is the inner critic. So that's the icon or the graphic there on the left. Then in the middle, there's the inner coach. And then next to it is the inner child. I've then got underneath the 24/7, the culturality. So if you Google culturality, you won't find much because I've made this word up. One day I'll write a paper on this. But it's basically where your personality and your culture come together, and there's like this Venn diagram, this overlap, where at least some, if not many of your beliefs are actually not so much yours. They're not personal to you. You have inherited them from your family, from your ancestors, from the climate, from the culture that you grew up in. And I certainly seen that when I moved to England or the UK from Iceland. When I left Iceland, I didn't think I was that Icelandic. And I know some people here who have crossed borders as well and have lived abroad or are still living, you know, somewhere else from their place of origin. You know, you've probably seen this as well, where actually there are behaviors and beliefs that you do and you have, they aren't specific to you, they're specific to where you have come from. And it can be helpful to look at them. Do I like that belief? Is it helpful to me? Do I want to keep it? And you may find that you want to keep some of them. So like I'm definitely keeping my sense of adventure, my kind of Viking curiosity. I'm definitely keeping that one. That kind of thrill seeking, well, I'm working on that one. Yeah. Being from Iceland, we were volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, blizzards, avalanches. And that's just like for breakfast, you know. So, and I was like, recently in the, because there've been so many volcanic eruptions in the last few years, that now when you are playing with kids in the playground, for example, you got them on the swing, a fun game at the moment, or in the last couple of years, is to shake the swings and play earthquake. So that little babies and toddlers get used to the ground shaking and that make it into a game. I mean, I don't think you'd get that in the UK. So it's even influencing our sense of humor. The land we live in, the climate that we grow up with affects how we do so many things. But also, Icelandic Vikings crashed the economy in 2008 and the country basically went bankrupt. So yes, it's good to have a bit of British sort of reserve, a bit of, you know, thinking things through, thinking things in talking about time in longer perspective. So like if you were born in the UK or you've lived in the UK, you may have seen an archaeology program called the Time Team. Those of you in the States or Argentina, you know, it may not have made it across the Atlantic, but it's basically a TV program where a group of archaeologists come to your back garden and they dig down until they find like Roman artifacts. And I remember when I first came to the UK, it blew my mind. In Iceland, you just tap, 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 and there's lava. I mean, you can't dig anything. And I know there's some archaeology like in the States, but it's definitely not as far as I can tell, not as cultural as it is here in the UK. And so it's interesting to play around with how does that change British people's perception of time? You know, that you know, you can dig 5,000 years in your back garden. And I think you don't often think about that. Or like, you know, the British culture has been there here for, you know, a couple of thousand years, whereas in Iceland, you know, that land was only settled just over 1,000 years ago. If we think about the US, you know, obviously they are on Native American land, but the sort of the American culture population is only 250 years old, give or take, you know. So how does that shape some of the beliefs and the ways that the culture shows up and values? So like the pioneer spirit is very strong in the US. You know, they started on the East Coast coming over from Europe, and then they made their way all the way over to the West Coast. You know, the gold rush and all of that kind of stuff. How does that bigger picture shape you? In the same way, faith groups, are you of Jewish origin? You know, is Muslim, Catholicism, you know, what is the faith input? Your beliefs about relationship, your beliefs around money. You know, so it can be interesting just to have a look at you exist in a context. And particularly sort of in the UK, less so than in both, I think, South America and North America, there is a real cultural belief to be hard on yourself. So when I did my master's thesis, what I discovered, what I found out in one of the research, is that the British have some of the harshest inner critic in the world. Exactly. That was mind-blowing to me. Particularly if you think about the Japanese and things, where there's a very strong external critic about shame and compliance and conformity. So recognizing there's a cultural component to even something like your inner critic. And if you think about those of you who are in the US or, you know, in Argentina, what has been the sort of inner critic inheritance that you got from the people who raised you, from the community groups that you grew up in? So that can be really important to play, you know, just pay attention to that. And then in terms of the inner coach, were you raised by somebody who encouraged you, who helped you grow, who helped you identify where you can strengthen, where you can sort of learn something new? Do you know what it feels like to genuinely feel love for yourself or feel unconditional love from somebody else? Those things can be definitely culturally at least influenced, if not determined. And then, of course, the inner child, the part of us that we all have that is still about 5 or 3. Yeah. And I remember I worked in the City of London for a few years, and I was doing a meeting at the London Stock Exchange at a board meeting, and I witnessed the biggest tantrum a 55-plus-year-old man could ever have. And it was so interesting how everybody just went really stum, very, very quiet, while this man just threw all his toys out of the pram, had a massive tantrum. But because he was like, a chief executive, really senior, it was absolutely tolerated, which is, bizarre. And for me, coming over from Iceland, I'd only been in the country like 2 or 3 years at this point. I was just like, whoa, how can this sort of exist? How can this be, accepted? So this tends to be a gendered thing. So for male or people identify as men or have been raised as men in this culture, there can be a different way of expressing inner child that can be absolutely accepted. Whereas women tend to be a lot more, they can be shamed for this a lot more than men. And that they can't be that childlike nature, they can't have that childishness. So it comes out in different ways. But I think, make no bones about it, we all have an inner child. And it can be helpful to get curious. How do you care for that inner child? And often can be able to identify, well, how old is your inner child? And it tends to be around a significant or profoundly important childhood experience. So for me, my inner child is always around 5 years old, because I experienced multiple traumas at that point, including childhood sexual abuse, which lasted about 18 months, frequent over that period, being separated from my parents for a period of time. So, and a couple of other things as well, moving countries. So it was a profoundly impactful time in my life. So when I stay with my inner child, it tends to be around the age of 5, sometimes a bit older, sometimes a bit younger, depending on what memory or what feeling is going on. But that tends to be where it hangs out, or the child that shows up the most. And I know that if I don't play, if I don't offer joy and play and fun to my inner 5-year-old, they are going to find a way to get my attention, just like a 5-year-old will do. Yeah. So it can be interesting just to play around with, what is it like for you? Can you even identify that you have got that childlike part? Or do you feel ashamed when you behave in a way that's childish or childlike? So that kind of curiosity can be helpful to stay with and get curious about. And that's also why self-compassion is so important, because some of this stuff, maybe not the most adorable or admirable behavior. So absolutely giving us a permission to sometimes be messy or unskillful in our behaviors. Then secondly, which is the chapter 10, is coming to your senses. So I love the fact that most here are English native speakers, or obviously English speakers, that in the English language, we have the phrase coming to your senses. Come to your senses, woman. It's like, what excellent advice. Just change the tone of voice. So it goes from critical to curious, or an encouraging invitation. It's like, come to your senses. Because that's where you can really shift and change your experience. So you can see your vision, there's an eye there, there's your hearing, there's your sense of taste, sense of smell, sense of touch. So it's about the things that you can access through your senses. So it could be movies, pictures, the view out your window. It can be sounds, like I used to fall asleep to the sound of the waves because I was so far from the sea. And I really missed, because I grew up on the coast. So I would have the sea as part of my soundscape all the time. When I was living in Cambridge, not close to the sea, so I would listen to the sound of the sea to go to sleep. Music, and then, or certain kind of bird sounds or rain or whatever, environmental sounds. Smells. So smell is the fastest acting sense to your amygdala. So the amygdala is kind of basically the klaxon bells alarm center in your brain that gets all the threats going. Or the threat response system going. So, and the theory is that because we have to be able to smell bad food before we actually consume it, it means that, just between here, when the food is on the fork, what will come into your nose, the smell needs to go from here into the center of your brain and to say, is this safe or not safe? Do I need to do something about this? And then you put the food in your mouth. So it's so quick that it acts faster than any of the other senses, and it acts faster as even the fastest top scoop in the most experienced meditator. And we've got aromatherapy, which uses sense of smell. And we've got perfumes and aftershaves when we want to be attracted to other people or ourselves. you know, so smell is profoundly important. And I think the example, if I remember correctly, Nikki, the example in the book, we talk about walking, if you're buying or selling a house, you know, sense of smell, smell of coffee or freshly baked bread, you know, these are very primal ways to help us get our own attention, to help us come back to ourselves. So we can then take a breath, we can then twiddle our toes and get some of our top scoop back online. Then we've got the location thing. So for those of you who read the chapter in the manual, it's about the spaces where we feel, you know, at least safer, maybe not fully safe. So one of my first aid spaces is the cinema. I worked in films for all of my 20s. I've always been a big film geek, and I will go to the cinema for first aid. Also, when I feel angry, one of my places is bowling. I go bowling. It really helps me focus my anger because to bowl, you have to focus on the pins. So I find it, you know, it doesn't happen. Maybe once every 2 or 3 years, I will go bowling for, you know, feeling reason because of a first aid space. For some, it's like the synagogue or the church or the temple. For some, it's nature. I think, Nikki, for you, it's the woods, the walk in the woods. That's kind of one of your first aid spaces. So really get a sense of what are the spaces where you feel more comfortable. I know, for example, that when I'm doing certain types of thinking, being in a cafe is perfect for me because it's just the right amount of sound stimulation and distraction for me to think creatively. I know when I need to think very deeply, being in the library or being in the study here is a more helpful space. So really it's playing around with what spaces nourish you. And then, of course, there is the kind of arrow going down to the case. So I don't know if you can see here on the shelf behind me, there's a briefcase, leather briefcase. In that briefcase is the demo kit from the first aid kit workshops or first aid workshops, and when we did them in person. And so the invitation here is to actually have it in one place, just like you had plasters and paracetamols in one place. So you don't have to traipse around the house with your finger bleeding, you know, wondering where it is. Or at least, you know, for most people, they will have a drawer or a shelf or something where you keep this stuff. Because remember, when you're in crocodile mode, you haven't got access to the part of the brain that remembers that it's good to go out for a walk in the woods, or that remembers to do the ABC, or that remembers to put on the playlist that helps you feel powerful and strong again, you know. So actually taking these things together, start to collect them, like the pebble that I have on my desk, you know, it was in my first aid kit for a long time, and now it just lives on my desk all the time. But to have these things in one place, so that when you're in whatever state of struggle, whatever state of suffering, all you need to do is to go to your first aid kit. That's the only thing, because in that moment, you won't remember anything else. And so having those prompts, and I think somebody put in the chat at the beginning kind of helpful reminders. Having reminders, you know, index cards, or I actually meant to get it out, I forgot. In the first aid kit demo kit, there's a set of index cards that are on a keyring. You can get them in like stationery shops. And those index cards will each have a message for a particular feeling. Also in the demo kit, I've got envelopes with letters. And on the front of the envelope, it says, when I feel anxious, when I feel angry, when I feel overwhelmed, or to my inner child. So we can write letters to experiences that we have or parts of ourselves, keep them in our first aid kit. And then we can go to that and remind ourselves of what your top scoop knows. It just hasn't got access to it in that moment when you're highly adrenalized. And of course, it's a 24/7 thing. Yeah. So it's something to bear in mind. So if you, for example, need one on the road, so I work with quite a few sign language interpreters who work in the car and done quite a few workshops for them, to actually think about it. If you spent a lot of time in your car, to have things in your car that's like a mini kit. Like if you're going in for surgery, having a little mini kit of little things that remind you of prompts or comforts. And even like when the dogs go into kennels or go into doggy daycare, they always have a t-shirt from me. So they have my smell. So, you know, 2/3 of your brain and mine is operating at the level of our animals, you know, our pets. So even just something like that. In my first aid kit, I've still got a perfume bottle for my best friend in Iceland. I've had that for 30 years. And even though there's no perfume left in that bottle, when I really miss her, I will just have a smell of her perfume. And I'm like, yes, she's here with me. So really bearing that in mind. And the key thing to remember is insight in mind. The opposite of out of sight, out of mind, which you may be more familiar with, to really recognize that. And therefore it has to, for a while, it's okay to keep it in your head, but actually really taking some time to invest in taking it external. And I know one woman I worked with a while ago, she actually used this opportunity to invest in a fun, expensive handbag, a big one of those big lush handbags, because she'd wanted that handbag for years. And she now uses that handbag for her first aid kit. And it's like just on her living room floor next to the sofa. But it's stashed full of things, but it's a beautiful handbag that she'd been desiring for a long time. And she gave herself the gift of that handbag for her first aid kit. So then the next one is bringing it all together. Yeah. So this is the last chapter, and you definitely got this, even though you may feel like, oh, I haven't quite got this or that, but you've got enough. Yeah. And then, of course, we've got the tune-up sessions in a couple of weeks, and you've got these recordings to come back to remind you, and you will have your first aid kit. So you've definitely got this. The key question, though, at this point in time is your story and your choice. Yeah, so you can go to the same old choice you've done before, or you can actually go towards a new choice. And this is the biggest risk when people do courses like this. Yeah, they're all buoyant. They're all like, this is great, I'm going to keep doing this. And by Wednesday next week, it's like, oh yeah, I was going to do that. I was going to do that last week. Yeah. So the risk here is that you will, in a very short space of time, you will go back to your habitual old choices. So the key thing is to recognize that you're going to have a couple of things. You're going to have hurdles. This is the hurdle jobs, the limitations. Yeah. You're going to struggle with things coming your way. Yeah. Life happens. Somebody goes into hospital, or there's a deadline at work, or suddenly you haven't got any new contracts coming into your business and you're like, how am I going to survive? So life always happens. I mean, the weather always happens, whether rain doesn't wait for us to have a raincoat. Rain just shows up. And how often do we need to get soaked to actually go, raincoat would be a good idea? So that kind of assuming that there will be hurdles, I think is the most helpful expectation I can help you set. That doesn't mean you've lost it, or like it's all pointless, or you're never going to get there. If we recognize that hurdles are part of the issue, or part of your experience, then you're much more likely to have an enjoyable experience. So then, apart from life, what else happens? Yeah. One is beliefs. I don't deserve this time. I don't, or I haven't got time, or other people are more important than me, or I'm going to do it later. That's a good one. I'll do it later. Yeah. So recognizing the beliefs, recognizing the things now before they happen that are likely to get in your way. And when you recognize them before, and when you know that you're likely to trip over, like prioritizing other people, deliberately putting something in your first aid kit, writing a letter to yourself, doing something that reminds you of why it's helpful to do a new choice rather than what you've always done. Remember that phrase? If you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you always got. Yeah. And at this point, I'd like you to just maybe get yourself a bit comfortable in your seats. Yeah. Maybe just shuffle your shoulders a little bit, twiddle your toes a little bit, because I want you to do a little bit of a thought experiment. And as you can see, if you follow the arrow from the person crossing the hurdle, you can see there's like a sort of light bulb, cogs, whatever. This is my symbol for experiments. Yeah. Little thought experiment here. So if you just gently soften your eyes, or close your eyes, so soften the focus of your eyes or close your eyes, just gently, maybe just take a breath, checking in, just bringing your awareness a bit more to the inside of your experience, away from the screen, away from anything else. And in this moment, just get a sense of the habit feeling or the habit energy that you feel is holding you back the most, that you struggle with the most. Just noting that it's there, recognizing that it's full of information. Now imagine that you will have that same experience for the rest of your life. Nothing's going to change. It's been with you till now, which is, maybe a decade or 2 or 3, and you're going to keep it for the rest of your life. And so, assuming and hoping that, you have a long and full life, you get to the end of your life, you have that rocking chair moment, and you look back, and this feeling is, or this habit has been with you all that time. Like a dragnet, sounds like something around your leg, just extra weight that you're carrying, or rucksack, or headwind, or because you've kept doing that same choice every single time. Next week, next month, next year, next decade, next few decades. And at the end of your life, nothing's changed. Breathing that in, noticing how the prospect of that feels. Just taking note. Right, that's how that feels. Then I'd like you to open your eyes. Maybe just roll your shoulders, shift a little bit. And if you can shift your posture a little bit, so you're kind of maybe sitting more upright or leaning against the other side of your chair. All right. Yeah. So then we're going to do another thought experiment. So again, gently soften the focus of your eyes or gently close your eyes. Gently breathing in. And again, coming to the inside of your experience, but this time, connecting with your imagination, this idea that you can actually change something now. So imagine making a new choice, a more helpful choice. A more helpful choice that gives you access to different feelings. Maybe feeling more joy or more confidence, feeling more trust, feeling more strength, feeling more agility, resilience. And imagine that new choice tomorrow, next week. And going forward, more and more of the time, you're able to do that more helpful new choice. Until in a year's time or 2 years' time, you're pretty much doing that new choice most of the time. And then taking that forward for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and then coming to that rocking chair moment at the end of your life. Thinking back to the choice you're making now and how you've been able to do more and more of that new choice. More self-compassion, more of that joy, strength, agility, trust. Whatever that feeling was that you want to choose more of the time. And imagine what it'll feel like to have felt that for all that time, knowing that you've come to that stage of your life, having lived that part of your life with a more helpful choice. You might find yourself smiling. You may find yourself having a little glow in your body. You may feel a bit more vibrancy or some ripples coming through your body. Whatever the sensations here, whatever your thoughts or emotions here, take note. Say, what does here feel like? It's almost like pressing save. Oh yeah, I want to just keep a sense of here. And then when you're ready, gently open your eyes. Maybe just give your body a bit of a stretch or a movement. Can be helpful to stroke down from your shoulders down to your fingertips. I don't know if you remember that one. Yeah. Maybe just placing your hand top of your collarbone. Yeah. Bit of self-contact. Remember that coming to your senses, the sense of touch? Yeah, that self-contact here. Yeah. So just noticing what here feels like. And so we're moving forward to thinking more in terms of experiments, whether they're thought experiments or behavioral experiments. And then that kind of circle at the bottom in the bottom right-hand corner, which is about new habits. So in the chapter, we talk about coupling or tagging, really some really practical hacks in terms of how to make habits sort of embed. You know, changing habits can be a really challenging thing to do. So how do we create the conditions for that to become easier? And then my message to you, or our message to you, is that you create ripples. Yeah, so that's you in the middle, and that whatever you do for you ripples out to benefit others. So I've been practicing with the phrase self-care is other care, because we often have the phrase of self-care is selfish, which I think is very last century thinking. So self-care is other care. So when you're able to really care beautifully and compassionately for yourself, not only are you role modeling how to do that to other people, but also you're much more available to other people. Because you're not crocodiling at them, or you're not kind of as caught up in your own stuff. So really recognizing the power of the ripple, the small gestures that kind of drip, drip, drip of the water, remember in the pebble, that ripple effect that you create when you're able to be more and more in love with yourself. You're able to be more and more enjoying your own self relationship. So I'm beaming here. I'm full of love for myself and you in this moment, which is a lovely, lovely feeling. So then let's get curious. Yeah. How can you hear your inner critic, your inner coach, and your child? It's normally through what we sort of internal self-talk that we identify them, and there are some clues as to how to identify them in the chapter. But it can also be through behaviors. Yeah, so we can sort of hear or see the behaviors. The second one is, where can you place your first aid kit and what would go into it? Yeah. So it needs to be insight in mind. So like somewhere where you can look at it rather than just in a cupboard. Not going to do much good there. And then what are the likely obstacles for you? So in the chapter, we talk about overwhelm, feeling stuck, or beliefs. So really work through some of those. We're speaking again in 2 weeks' time, you know, for your tune-ups, your individual tune-ups. So we can look at if you are stuck or tripping over some of these, any one of those three or anything else. And then what's going to be your first new choice for you to make into a habit? Yeah. And then what will you tag it to? Will you couple it or tag it to brushing your teeth, or tag it to when you get into the car, or when you put the kettle on? Or, you know, how are you going to help yourself embed that new habit? So then we're coming to the end of teaching, and Nikki, in a minute, if I'm going to ask you to press stop recording. But for those of you who have been with us for the recording, at this point, really do take some time with those questions. Think about, you know, what your answers are, write things down, make note to help you really get the most of today's recording. Thank you, and please press stop. It looks like you might be having a bit of trouble there, Nikki.
Yeah, I don't have the stop recording button here.
So if you go down to the 3 dots on the more.
Yeah, I've still only got breakout rooms.
Oh, actually, am I recording?
Yeah.
Love it. I'm recording, so I'm going to stop sharing. For those of you who want to be off camera, just bear that in mind while I stop sharing. Excellent. And then I will